the top 10 greatest Baltimore Ravens of all time. Today, we're going to start off at number 10 with Jamal Lewis. One of the greatest looks, I think, of any NFL player of all time, those heavy shoulder pads. To this day, still, I think, in my opinion, has um, the greatest all-time season by a Baltimore Raven ever. Obviously, we're talking about those 2,000 yards that he had in 2003 that helped him win NFL MVP. Unfortunately, he only played 6 seasons with the Baltimore Ravens, so he can't be much higher than number 10, but certainly he is one of the greatest Baltimore Ravens of all time. On the topic, we're talking about the Ravens. We're also releasing the video on the Washington Commanders previously. And again, this is my dad's favorite team, so soft spot for the Baltimore Ravens, sure. And some of these players being a newer franchise, I actually got to see as a child, so it brings back nostalgic memories. At number 9, we're going to go with one of the first ever football cards that I ever packed. That was Haloti Ngata. Two-time first-team All-Pro selection, five-time All-Pro, one of the greatest nose tackles of all time, just mammoth of a human being, extremely important for that Baltimore Ravens defense that ended up helping to win a Super Bowl in 2012. Haloti Ngata is one of the greatest Baltimore Ravens defensive players of all time. And number 8, we're going to go with someone on the other side of the trenches, Marshall Yanda, six-time All-Pro, member of the 2010s All-Decade team, another mammoth of a human being. Looks completely different now that he is retired. Looks extremely skinny, but don't take that. Don't underestimate him just because of that. In his prime, he was an absolute mauler in the run game. Extremely strong, extremely good at just anchoring himself and just being able to run over opposing defensive line. Marshall Yanda was one of the most dominant interior linemen of my childhood. At number 7, we're going to go with Joe Flacco. The first 5 years of his career was well on pace. He was the greatest quarterback in Baltimore Ravens history until a recent three-time MVP, who we'll get to later. Led the Ravens to 4 AFC championship appearances in his first 5 seasons, including a Super Bowl win in 2012. He ended up being the Super Bowl MVP in that game, of course. But after that was rather very mediocre, which is why I just don't have him much higher on this list, but is the all-time leading passer in several statistical categories for the Ravens, and definitely should be given credit for how good he was those first 5 to 6 years with the Ravens. At number 6, this is where the list kind of gets uncomfortable, obviously. This man has some very disturbing and, if true, very disgusting allegations surrounding him. Justin Tucker is the player I'm talking about at number 6. I feel uncomfortable talking about him and giving him credit at this point, knowing that he could be guilty of such a heinous crime. But at the end of the day, just objectively speaking, as far as football goes, he is one of the greatest Baltimore Ravens of all time, one of the greatest kickers of all time. There's no taking that away from him, being a five-time first-team All-Pro and whatnot. But as far as the off-the-field stuff, look, if he is guilty, he is an absolute terrible human being. But it still, at the end of the day, doesn't take away from the fact that he was actually a great football player. And number 5, on a more what's the word? More exciting note, we'll go with one of my favorite players of all time, none other than Terrell Suggs. As you could see in this picture, of course, Terrell Suggs was wearing the Bane mask. One of the most intimidating players of my childhood growing up watching him. Finished his career with 137 and a half sacks with the Ravens. Former defensive player of the year, former leader in sacks a couple years. Several times did he win the first team All-Pro selection awards. Terrell Suggs, one of the greatest Baltimore Ravens of all time. At number 4, we're going to go with another intimidating presence and another mammoth of a human being, none other than the Baltimore Ravens' first ever draft pick, number 1 overall pick in 1996. That would be Hall of Famer Jonathan Ogden. Played 12 seasons with the Ravens. Was, if I'm not mistaken, a 6-time first team All-Pro selection. Just absolute mauler in the run game. Great at just being able to pull and run. revolutionary for future players like a Joe Staley, for instance. Extremely athletic, but even better in the pass game. Just could not get past him. He was extremely strong and extremely deserving of being number 4 on this list. At number 3, we're going to go with the three-time first-team All-Pro selection, not three-time MVP. That would be Lamar Jackson. Of course, the controversial circumstances around whether he should have or should not have won MVP. You guys already know my opinion on that. But Lamar Jackson undoubtedly is the greatest quarterback in Baltimore Ravens history at this point, even though he has not yet won a Super Bowl. There are some things that he does for the Ravens that Flacco just could not do. Carry the Ravens several times in the postseason. He's one of the winningest quarterbacks in NFL history at such a young age already. And 2 MVPs speaks for itself. The greatest rushing quarterback of all time also speaks for himself, and a guy who is quickly making a name for himself as a top 20 quarterback of all time. Very shortly into his NFL career. At number 2, however, these two are very much, you can't really argue against them. I went personally with Ed Reed at number 2. If you're talking about who's more important to the Ravens, there's an argument to be made. Ed Reed comes in number 1. Personally, I'm talking about who's more historic to the franchise, and obviously Ed Reed only played 11 years. Number 1 played 17 seasons with the Ravens, but Ed Reed is the greatest free safety of all time. And what he did for the Ravens was nothing short of just spectacular. Ed Reed, one of the greatest ball hawkers, one of the smartest players of all time, one of the greatest special teams players of all time at that too, just great at blocking punts. Ed Reed deserves his spot at number 2 on this list. On almost any other franchise, he might be even number 1. At number 1, however, we're going to go with the greatest linebacker of all time, 2-time Defensive Player of the Year, absolute killer linebacker. That would be none other than Ray Lewis, who was also the Super Bowl MVP for the Ravens when they and the leader of that dominant 2000 defense that ended up winning the Super Bowl for Baltimore. I think, if I'm not mistaken, 9-time first team All Pro selection, maybe 10, all time leading tackler in the history of the NFL. Just an intimidating force, much like Terrell Suggs. Every person in Baltimore knows about his iconic dance before every game. Was the leader of that Baltimore team through and through. And Ray Lewis is the greatest Baltimore Raven of all time.